I'm going to present something today that, at least on the outset, it's going to look less quantitative, and that's okay for some kinds of research. But let me give you just a little bit of a background. When I started looking at personality psychology, it was almost by accident. I was doing my MFA, Masters of Fine Arts in Professional and Creative Writing. And I thought for my thesis, which had to be a full-length book, I was going to write a memoir, and it was going to be on intergenerational fatherhood. So I wanted to look at fatherhood from the perspective that we all play different roles. And even though, it's gender specific, for fatherhood, obviously daughters and mothers, play into this in different ways. But you start out as a child. And for most of us, our biggest icon, the hero, the dragon slayer in our lives is our father. And then we grow up, and if you get into Freud at all, you see sometimes there's that transition of childhood and adolescence where you're kind of combative, potentially, maybe not, with your father and trying to find your own way. And then soon after that, you become a father. And now you have a child and you have an aging father. And then you eventually see your father pass on. And now you see your children having children. And there's all of this intergenerational play where your role stays constantly changing, but it's in this flow. And so I wanted to write about that. And it was going to be, memoir from my perspective, a lot of storytelling. But as I started getting into some of the background, because like a Malcolm Gladwell book, I still wanted there to be a concrete foundation that was following studies and supportive research. And that took me so far in that direction. I was so surprised how much amazing information there was. I didn't even know there was a field called personality psychology. I knew there was developmental psychology, which is where I started looking. And then I find out that developmental psychology, personality psychology, positive psychology, they've all kind of sprung out of one another. And primarily one of the biggest epicenters of this is University of Pennsylvania. So I got so interested in personality psych and developmental psych that it started leading into social psych, because how we interact with these things and our roles in life certainly is magnified, and we magnify ourselves through social dynamics. So I ended up then, after that degree, going into social psychology and then social science. And so it's taken me down this path that I just never even knew existed. And I've found, I think the reason so many people are attracted to psychology is always one of the popular, degrees for undergraduates and so forth, and self-development as a genre, is that we're all trying to figure these things out about ourselves. We have these intuitions, we have these experiences, and even in today's topic, we're trying to succeed at certain things. We're trying to live our best lives. And it's not always just in the how-to. You don't just get a plan. Everybody on the planet, reads the same book, and then we all do the same thing and get the same results. There's this entire mix, and it comes down to our personality. So yesterday, well, first of all, in our Nutrition Coaching Global Mastermind this week, I talked about a client of mine who had this, who wanted this immersive experience. So he decided to uproot himself, move to Evansville, Indiana, where he could just, sit at my feet and train with me 4 times a week. And we would go grocery shopping together, and we would do everything. It was going to be so easy and amazing and perfect. He wanted to set himself up into this utopia. And it was great for a while because, he did create that immersive experience. But very, very soon, the wheels started coming off the car. And pretty soon he's spiraling out of control, and he had regressed completely. He had lost about 15 to 20 pounds with me in about 3 months. And then all of a sudden he was missing workouts, gaining weight back. He ended up gaining 10 to 15% more weight than he'd even lost. So why does somebody who is that hell-bent on success and is willing to go to that extreme, why would that happen? And I'm going to show today the power of personality. What happens to us, from the time we're born, first of all, with our genetics, just the DNA that is encoded from our predecessors, but then, how environmentally are our brains impacted by everything from our childhood and so forth. So one part of this story that I did not tell Tuesday in the Nutrition Coaching Global Mastermind, I picked up and finished in our newest Mind Muscle Connection podcast, which was yesterday. So it was just released. I'll announce it here in a little bit. But I had forgotten to finish that story Tuesday night because I left off where I said, I just kind of pressed pause with that client. I said, after 2 weeks of him just completely not showing up, I said, let's just kind of move you off the schedule. I'm going to refund your money. And, I just kind of let it go at that. I didn't do it to punish him. I felt very, very bad that I was getting paid to do nothing. I mean, I was doing nothing for him. And so my words to him were, I'm clearly not doing for you what you need. And so let's just take a break. And I thought that would potentially hurt him personally, and it did. And so I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks. And then as I'm thinking through this, because I'm a ruminator and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I hope I didn't really hurt his feelings. I hope he's doing okay. So I wanted to check in on him, but make sure I did it in a way that wasn't pressuring him, toward our initial goals. I didn't want him to think it was very performance based. But what really prompted me to dig in and try and pursue him back as a friend, and I did. I just invited him to play golf, go have a drink, let's just chat, let's be friends, and we'll put this professional relationship on hold. But then it dawned on me what I did to this guy. What I didn't tell the group Tuesday night was he was adopted. So he found out as a child he was adopted. And for a lot of kids, no matter how many ways you can say it's the best thing and on and on and on, you feel abandoned. I mean, why was I not good enough? Why did my parents not love me? Even though that's completely illogical, a child never knows the full story. That completely codes an adolescent's brain when that's what you think in your greatest relationships in life, like that's going through your brain. So then with his adoptive parents, they get a divorce. So guess what? Dad number 2 abandons him. Then dad number 3 is a raging alcoholic. You can't please him. He's a hard ass. And so he learns that, first of all, I'm not even worthy of being stayed with. But now I have to perform a certain way just to get the respect, of my third dad. And guess what I did to him when he was not showing up? Guess what I did? Maybe dad number 4. I abandoned him. I fired him. I kicked him off my schedule. I did exactly what he was in the pattern of getting. And it creates this cycle. And probably because of his own personality, which I'm going to come back to a little bit later, he even almost creates that constant loop. So when we talk about the predictive power of personality traits, had I been thinking about this ahead of time, I could have put a little more thought into understanding where he was coming from in the first place, why he thinks the way he thinks, why he struggles with the things he struggles with. But this is the power of personality and where this comes from. So I took today's information instead of from a single study. I found this book, Personality Psychology and Economics. And as I mention once in a while, I like to sometimes go out of our field to see how many correlations there are to our field, because we can get pretty myopic with just looking at, health and weight loss and that sort of thing. Interestingly, even though I did not expect this, you're going to see some notes from this book, a 181-page book. Again, one of the authors from University of Pennsylvania, and they do talk about health. They do talk about health outcomes. So there's an interesting little correlate there. But let me read a couple things here. Got to move this grid down. So this is right from kind of the premise of the book. This section, which I'm going to deal with, discusses empirical evidence on the power of personality in predicting life outcomes. A growing body of evidence suggests that personality measures, especially those related to conscientiousness and to a lesser extent neuroticism, predict a wide range of outcomes. And then they talk about how a lot of people have tried to correlate IQ, just gross intelligence, to outcomes in life. And they said that that's okay. Like there are some things you can correlate, but personality traits absolutely have a greater outcome prediction model. So one of the things I want to mention here too is because I'm not analyzing a particular study or meta-analysis, I'm not going to talk about methodology. They cite a bunch of studies. This is an actual textbook, so they're the ones citing all these studies throughout their work. And if you're interested in that level of discussion, you can always look up the book. There's a PDF online. But I just wanted to kind of stick to their interpretation, take it on face value, and talk about it. But out of all of the personality profiles or measurements, assessments you can take, to make it simple, they tried to stick to the language of the big five. And I want to explain a couple of the most common. So if you guys have not ever taken a personality test, I'm going to give you an assignment because I think it could be very revealing to you. First of all, you can just do an internet search for the big five personality traits, and you will see it's broken up into these five, and they some of them are labeled differently. So extroversion is typically extroversion. Agreeableness is sometimes talked about in a different way. Conscientiousness is always there. Neuroticism is often talked about, as you'll see coming up. Not as neuroticism, but let me see if I can find the other one here because I don't want you guys to get confused. We may see it as it comes up here. I'll come back to that. Neuroticism, I'll explain as it correlates to conscientiousness. So conscientiousness is somebody who's extremely meticulous, as you can read on the screen. Self-efficacy, orderliness, dutiful, achievement, striving, self-disciplined, cautious. That's conscientious. I think that's pretty easy to understand. Neurotic is to take that to an unhealthy level. So if I'm the kind of guy who has to have all my paper clips lined up a certain way on my desk, that's obviously somebody who's conscientious. If I freak out, if you move one of them and I get angry and it just ruins my day, then that's now neurotic. Now you've gone too far and it really unbalances your emotional state. So again, they're close together, but one is kind of positive and one is kind of negative. And then openness, which is, I don't want to say it's like introversion, but it's interesting that they put extroversion without introversion on this. But I think you'll see a couple of reasons why as we go. So one of the things I learned very quickly about personality psychology, in the best sense that you can interpret it, they typically, you should think of them, or at least it's proposed that you should think of them as scales. So it's not that you have great conscientiousness or you don't. If you're high in conscientiousness, you may be kind of low in something else. And the creators of personality psychology, Drs. Seligman and Peterson, they wrote this book, the Handbook of Character Traits and Virtues. And they actually have 6 categories of virtues, and they divide those up into 24 traits. So as academics, they really define this specifically. But there is a test that you can take for this one, and it's the VIA test. And I think that is really fun to take. It's a little bit longer test, but it's a really good one. So here's what this looks like. Wisdom, courage, humanity, transcendence, justice, and moderation. If you dig into what those really mean, you can see how they have some opposites. So for example, if I'm really, really high in justice, if I'm somebody who's a stickler for the just world theory, everything has to be orderly, everything has to be fair. And these are the people who if this isn't fair, I'll take it to the streets myself and I'll fix it. I'll be that person. So they're also very high, as you'll see, in like leadership and even over on the courage side, they correlate to bravery and so forth. That's the opposite of love and kindness and social intelligence. Somebody who's kind of laid back and is going to be less impulsive. So, you see how these things go in slides or scales compared to each other. Then, of course, there's always the Myers-Briggs. And even, you could look into the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory, but everybody loves to like, what are you? Are you an INTJ? Are you this? Are you that? This one is kind of, it's the classic, it's the OG, so to speak. But I think it also has some interesting things to teach us. But I'm going to show you, I've taken these tests over time. The first time I took that VIA was in 2014 when I was doing my thesis in developmental and personality psychology. And so I took that VIA test, and I had not looked at it in a long time. And I pulled it up today to show you guys where I rank on this, because I want to show you how these personality traits correlate to our actual outcomes. And this particular book, being an economics book, they looked heavily at your ability to hold a job, what kind of occupations are typically held by different personality types, your income, your revenue generating potential, who are the biggest earners, the most stable earners, and so forth, who are the ones who are happiest in their careers. But then they also looked at these other things, as we're going to discuss, like health and longevity, which I was very, very happy to see. So I'm going to go through a list of just general correlations. And when you look at, and again, they're looking at the big five primarily. They use some different language once in a while, but they're looking at the big five in personality types. And they're saying, okay, if we're looking at income, career satisfaction, that kind of thing, outcome, even criminality they looked at, then, what kind of correlations can we just see in general before we get too specific? And the ones that correlate together the most are the senses of reciprocity and trust. So, for example, just to give you an idea of how to kind of condition your brain to think about personality psychology, if I'm really, really high on trust, if I think, if I instantly, like Dan and I meet and I like Dan, Dan likes me, I immediately trust Dan. If Dan says, hey, this bottle of wine is a good bottle of wine, I'm not going to say, wow, I wonder if Dan's trying to screw me. I wonder if he's playing a trick on me. Like, I would never think that, because I have a high level of trust. And that also tends to correlate with reciprocity. And ironically, I am very much a gift giver, another personality trait spinoff. If you look at the languages of love, the love languages that Dr. Gary Chapman came up with decades ago, I'm a gift giver. So because I like reciprocity, I would tend to be somebody who trusts more, because since I love to give things, I feel deeper social connection instantly. I trust, more than other people may trust. And so those two kind of things go together. Same thing with risk aversion, because I trust, I tend to maybe say, okay, I'm not going to, those are actually correlated negatively. I forgot to put that negatively. That if I'm highly trusting, then, my risk aversion score is going to be, probably kind of high, because I trust too much. And so I'm not very risk averse. And this comes out in my own personality tests. Risk aversion and agreeableness. So if somebody is risk averse, they don't like to take risks, they may have a higher sense of agreeableness. But this is where I want to really point out a couple things. These next three lines, when they said right at the outset in that first paragraph of section 7 of this book, that conscientiousness is the thing. It is the pivot point for all predictive elements of success in life endeavor. And they said, and neuroticism is a close second. Neuroticism is like that evil twin of conscientiousness. You step over the line from conscientiousness to neuroticism, and where conscientiousness is most correlated to success, neuroticism is most negatively associated with ambition and success. So how we always tend as human beings to look for the theory of everything. We want one answer. We want to find the bottom foundation. And this is one of those things where we can say, okay, look at all of these personality traits and virtues, and let's try and synthesize it down into maybe just the top 5. And then other people have made a grid of 4. And now what they're saying through this research is that really, if you're talking about the predictive nature of personality, it comes down to just two. There's a right and a wrong, a good and a bad, a binary, just like our brains like it. And so if you're very, very highly conscientious, then that's the good path toward success and happiness. If you're really high on neuroticism, you're going down the wrong path. And think about it like this. Like my client who uprooted himself, just took his whole life and just discarded it and said, I'm going to move to Evansville, and this is going to be an amazing thing. That is an incredibly impulsive move. He is off the chart in neuroticism and impulsivity. I mean, those are synonyms. And so guess what happened? So far, he has not succeeded. And when you look at other areas of his life, he has been very challenged in that he is skilled in a lot of areas, but always finds a way to lose his job, always finds a way to get fired from amazing positions. He's a high income earner because of his technical background and very creative, a musician, and everything he does just ends up burning in flames. And it's truly, and I've known this guy for 20 some years, so I'm not just trying to diagnose him from a couple of months of working together. It's truly because he would score off the charts on neuroticism and very low on conscientiousness. So let's look at these last two lines and then we'll move on. So performance motivation. So just, I'm motivated to perform. That's very extroversion. Fear of failure, internal locus of control, curiosity. I'm going to explain low discount rate in a minute, and risk aversion are positively correlated to IQ test and correct answers. So people who tend to kind of get the right answer, you remember we talked about moral psychology, and that's more of a limbic system thing. It's not how much knowledge we have in our brain. It's that we've kind of made that decision once as a value. Internal locus of control is self-efficacy. I believe that I can control my outcome. I believe I'm in control of my life. Curiosity means I'm secure enough to go out there and seek things, openness. I am motivated. I definitely am risk averse. I don't want to fail. That's what makes me conscientious. Low discount rate is an economic term that describes when somebody has some wealth or their welfare increases. Is there a difference between the acute benefit to their life and the chronic benefit? And so that discount rate, how much of a gap? And the best way to think of it is like the lottery winners. You guys have heard everybody who wins the lottery ends up like bankrupt within a year. Not everybody, but it's the people who never really earned money on their own. They were never conscientious enough to do it. They never had those skill sets or personality traits. All of a sudden you dump a pile of money on their lap. The discount rate's high. They're living life right now like it really had an impact on their life now, but in a year has zero impact because they've blown it all. So that's what that is. That's, again, this is an economic textbook. But negative fear of failure. So instead of fear of failure, like, oh man, I want to succeed. Negative fear of failure is, oh my gosh, I better not fail because so-and-so will think horribly of me, or daddy won't be proud of me anymore. And extroversion, where you have to, always be out there. You got to always be looked at. You got to be the center of attention. Those are negatively associated. So I'm trying to paint a picture of these two poles. Again, this scale, this continuum. Somebody who's incredibly thoughtful, somebody who's motivated, somebody who has that strong internal compass and intrinsic motivation, somebody who's secure enough to be curious, somebody that you could give them this massive pile of wealth and it wouldn't really change their life. It's just like they're cautious. Those are high IQ people typically, and they're less impulsive. They're more mindful. Somebody who's neurotic and impulsive and just, living out in front of everybody, they're external processors. This is the person who never shuts up. As soon as a thought hits their brain, it's out of their mouth, to their own detriment. So these are two strong things that they really started to see uncovered in this research. So I think this is the last page of this, but intrinsic motivation, curiosity, internal locus of control, again, a lot of these same things, emotional stability, risk aversion, that normal discount rate, and conscientiousness are negatively associated with responsiveness to incentive. I put the exclamation there and even bolded it because you guys know this is my hobby horse, intrinsic versus external motivation. When you are intrinsically motivated and you are emotionally stable and you are secure enough to be curious and to explore, you are not as responsive to incentive. So if somebody says, hey, I'll give you $20 if you go touch that electric fence, you're going to be the one that says, yeah, no, thanks. Or, hey, I'll bet you can't, jump your bike over that ravine. I'll give you $20 for that. Or, these crazy things that make people do impulsive things, or just risk all their money in the stock market. How many people, when Bitcoin starts rising, all of a sudden you got all these armchair investors who put all their money, into a single stock or something, and then they're broke in 2 weeks. So those people with the most internal stability are not externally motivated. They're even keel. Leisure preference and openness to experience. So people who just aren't that serious and yet they are still kind of open, that's that extroversion, are positively associated with responsiveness to incentive. So the people who are externally motivated, those are the ones that if you feel that way, if you've ever said these words, if I just had this, or, hey, trainer, hey, coach, let's do this. Let's have this great contest, motivate me. I need you to tell me exactly what to do. Let's have this contest. You got to watch out, because if that's your thought process, you are an externally motivated person and you're probably on the side that's more neurotic and less conscientious. So this is where some of those correlates come back to IQ. The top 25% IQ earners, or I'm sorry, the top 25% of people with the highest IQ are bigger risk takers. And here's what's interesting. This is a two-sided coin, because you sometimes you think your brain is a little bit better than it is, and you think you know everything. And so you're willing to risk some things out of arrogance, and you can lose. But you can also be somebody who's somewhat high IQ and take bigger risks, but measured smart risks. And there's a difference there. That's why they said IQ is not the biggest correlate to outcome, because, even though you can look at the ends of these bell curves, the bottom 25% are twice as likely to quit a job within a year. Some risk pay off, some don't. And you got the bottom who's down here. I think some of these personality traits, we have to look at the true organic measure, because when I see this bottom line, that the bottom 25% are twice likely to quit a job within a year, again, maybe just kind of impulsive. My boss pissed me off, and so screw you. I don't need this job, and I'm going to walk off. And you don't think about that long-term hit. Sometimes that is personality traits, as we're describing. Sometimes it is actual intellectual capacity, your ability to even think through those things. So, something I think we all need to give each other a little bit of grace with in trying to interpret each other. So here's a couple more. A factor that loads heavily on self-control. So anything that you're trying to measure, anything you're looking at that is most dependent on self-control, consideration of the future consequences, elaboration of consequences, effective mindfulness, and conscientiousness, those are negatively associated with discount rate, like I said. So again, if you're somebody who is very conscientious, your look at your acute state and your long-term trajectory isn't that different. You're playing the same game now as you plan on playing in 30 years. Whereas, I will say my dad, I've told you guys that I grew up extremely poor. And my dad started out, I think, in a place in, kind of in the 60s and 70s where anybody working hard could make a good living. And so he was a new car salesman and became the general manager of a car dealership. And, we didn't have necessarily a bad life. I mean, we were definitely poor, 5 kids and only one income, and, not a college degree holder. It was lower level, but it was survivable. But due to occupational gentrification, once my dad hit about my age and he lost his job, now he was no longer able to even earn that. I mean, he never made more than a third of that level of income the rest of his life. And to see somebody go, almost through that shock, and now all of a sudden you go from, stable but barely making ends meet to just abject poverty. His thought process of how to get out was always like to win the lottery. Just wait until we win the lottery. Just wait until I get that winning lottery ticket. And it's never, and that's that discount rate. Instead of doing the little things it takes to pull yourself back up, at 48, 50, 52 years old, when he lost his job, what if he went to a trade school? What if he went back to college and got a degree, and then he had another 20 years of higher income or something? But instead, it was always just, fanciful, imaginative thinking that was never going to come true. So again, it comes down to that internal locus of control and mindfulness. But here's what's interesting. I just got to note my internet is stable or unstable, so I'm going to wait for a second. Okay. So a factor or a variable that loads on, or that is dependent on blood pressure, or you're correlating, measuring things against blood pressure, is positively associated with the discount rate. So again, why would this be? Why would somebody with higher fluctuating blood pressure be positively associated with all of those things due to impulsivity? I think it kind of makes sense if you think about it, in that if I'm so impulsive that everything sends me into an emotional tailspin, everything makes me angry, everything makes me impulsive, then obviously that's going to show up biometrically by blood pressure. So again, they're showing that thoughtfulness versus impulsiveness, the ability to regulate your own emotion, which is the definition of emotional intelligence. You having the ability to think through your circumstances, to think through your emotion. That's also the cornerstone of what conscientiousness is. So if we boil all this down to one thing, if we truly can find a theory of everything in personality psychology, remember, we're looking at the predictive nature. Can you predict somebody's outcome just by their score on a personality inventory? They're saying, before presenting a detailed survey of the effects of personality and cognition on a variety of outcomes, it's useful to have an overview of the main findings. One principal finding in our survey, the principle, is that conscientiousness is the most predictive of almost every outcome. Like I said, even criminality. I was actually hoping they were going to say conscientious people were the most criminal, so I could say that, I've got that in my back pocket if I need it. But it's actually the opposite. Conscientious people are the least criminal. But let's get into some of the other findings, and I think you'll see how this is supported. Measures of personality predict a range of educational outcomes. Of the big 5, conscientiousness best predicts overall attainment and achievement in education. Other traits such as openness to experience, which again, I think takes a lot of internal security, predict finer measures of educational attainment, such as attendance and the course difficulty selected, what you actually choose to do with that. But traits related to neuroticism affect educational attainment, although the relationship is not always monotonic. So, those, remember, neuroticism and conscientiousness, close cousins. So neurotic people often seek education as well, but it doesn't necessarily pay off. Like my clients, highly educated, highly technical guy, super, super intelligent, and his life is just a constant chaotic shitstorm. So very fine line between those two things. So let's look at a couple more things. Personality measures also predict a variety of labor market outcomes. Of the big 5 traits, conscientiousness, of course, best predicts overall job performance, but is less predictive than measures of intelligence. So now we get back into IQ to look at like who actually has the means to do something. So being conscientious doesn't mean you are the most intelligent. There correlative, but there are still people who may not be. Think of somebody who's highly intelligent, but may not be that conscientious. I think about my wife. She would probably score about a 0 on conscientiousness. That's a personality trait, but she's still highly intelligent. So she's one of these people who, her side of the bedroom, because we are truly like the Odd Couple, like my side looks like the Boston Public Library. Everything's in its place and orderly, and hers looks like a flea market. But yet we're both, intelligent people who get along. We just happen to have two different sides of that conscientious scale. I hope she never watches these things. She has access. I may have to watch what I start saying here. But many traits predict sorting into occupations consistent with economic models of comparative advantage. That's not all that interesting to us today. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, and I've got one more note on this after this slide, but all the big 5 traits predict some health outcomes. However, again, conscientiousness is the most predictive of longevity, even more so than intelligence. So now, you get into, pick somebody that you think on just an organic level, not education attained, but somebody who may not be the most intelligent, but they're still very conscientious. They have their routines, they have their patterns, they have their values, and their health values are to eat well, to do well. They may work out. So again, intelligence isn't the same thing as conscientiousness. You get intelligence and conscientiousness together, and you probably got, somebody who's going to do okay in life. But across the entire spectrum of education and IQ, conscientiousness is still the foundational personality trait. And again, it makes so much sense, but maybe until you've seen some research and you see it laid out in these terms, it doesn't have the same impact. But somebody who's conscientious, they really do have those internal values, like we've talked about in other research reviews. They really have these values where they say, I'm this kind of person. I'm the kind of person who takes care of themselves. I'm the kind of person who works out because you're supposed to. I'm the kind of person who eats well because I know the research says it reduces your risk of heart disease. That's not an impulsive trait. That's not a chaotic trait. That's an internal center of security, making logical decisions because of my health values kind of trait, which again is the definition of conscientiousness. So here we go. So before I ever knew what this exam was, we were all sitting at a table. I was having dinner with some friends in Los Angeles, and some friends of mine were talking about this. And I'm like, what is it? What is it? And they said, oh, here, somebody pulled it up on their phone and said, you got to take this test. And to this day, I've just kept it. This is my first shot at this. And look where I score on conscientiousness. And jokingly, as I say, not to brag here, but doesn't it make sense when you look at my resume that you would say, yeah, Joe kind of likes to do things. Joe likes to be active. Joe likes to, keep his head down and work hard. There are a couple things that do surprise me in a negative way. Well, not negative way, but it does show again how close neuroticism is. So this is where I said that these things take a different turn. But let me show so emotional stability, that's the same as neuroticism. So it's just labeled differently. So I'm high on conscientiousness, but I'm also pretty darn high on neuroticism. So it depends on which voice in my head I'm listening to, right? I will tell you 15, 20, 30 years ago, my neuroticism would have been close to 100 and conscientiousness would have been lower, because there was a time in my life where I was much more impulsive and I was definitely, just that person who would jump before thinking. And so it's taken me a lot of work and refinement to kind of flip those around. But again, very, very close cousins. So you know how I always talk about being an introvert. Look at that extroversion score, 4 out of 100. And interestingly, I guess I'm kind of glad there are a number of books now talking about how introverts are kind of where you want to be, because as an internal processor, you tend to be more thoughtful, more mindful. You're not getting yourself into trouble by speaking before you think. And that kind of thing. And so I'll take it. It kind of matches up with I guess who I want to be after all, even though I've had to work to at least come out of my shell once in a while. So this VIA, values in action, and they have that. I think I put their website on a previous slide. VIA character or characteristics, something like that, .org. They're somehow affiliated. This is actually a nonprofit in Cincinnati. Somehow they're affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania. But you can take this inventory and it'll give you the entire list of the 24 character strengths. And I did this in 2014. So when I was doing my thesis in personality and developmental psych. And number one was love of learning. That's no surprise. Curiosity and interest, no surprise. Zest and enthusiasm and energy, no surprise. Appreciation of beauty and excellence, no surprise. Leadership, yeah. I mean, I guess I'm a little surprised, but as Dan has said, I'm kind of the reluctant leader. But I pulled up the whole thing, and I'm going to look on this other screen to tell you, because I want you to I want you to see the bottom. I want you to see what I suck at. Number 24, my worst trait whatsoever is spirituality. So I tend to be a little bit more of a rationalist. But then look at my second to worst trait, caution, prudence, and discretion. And again, I have to own that. Like, that makes sense. That's high neuroticism. And that's what I, have always, battled with a little bit. So I'm not the most cautious or prudent, type person. So anyway, these are the kind of things where if you look at these inventories and you start to understand some of the descriptions and read some of what the authors are trying to convey, it's not the goal for us to fix ourselves or others. It's not to say, oh, this is who I should be and I'm not. I need to recreate myself. The goal is to look at those. And just like I said here, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, I could have saved myself a lot of, potential problems in life and relationships had I just started working a little sooner and intentionally on conscientiousness versus neuroticism. But when you can look at those things, you can say, wow, that's, I get it. Like, I am that way. I can kind of figure out why, who in my life phenotypically do I kind of favor? Like, do I have a mother, a father, or a grandfather or grandmother somewhere that I can say, yeah, I guess I am kind of like that person. And as I view it in somebody else, I can see that I don't like that. I don't like that about them. So why do I do that? Maybe I need to try and temper that a bit. Or you look at some of these traits like conscientiousness and curiosity and the love of learning and having that internal self-efficacy. And you can ask, how do you get more of that? Like, what does that person think like? How do they make decisions? And then you can gradually add those kind of mindfulness tactics into your thinking. And of course, they gradually become habit. But it's not that you ever erase these personality traits. You have this huge organic, neurologically primed and cemented set of genetics. Then you have your entire environment where your brain was formed in certain environments, and that never goes away. Well, our brains aren't even fully formed until we're 25 to 30 years old. And so when your brain is developing and growing and wiring itself together in a certain environment, who you are 50 years later, you can't undo that. So you always have to have this level of self-awareness of, okay, these are my tendencies. I am that person to lash out angrily, or I am that person to make impulsive decisions. So I need to have a cycle, a pause button. I need to have a way to make myself trigger a timeout so I can do something differently than my nature naturally would lead me to. So, I don't want to give anybody the assumption that as soon as you just kind of learn these things, check off a few boxes, you can become a new person. But it is all we have. Those are the tools to at least start to become so self-aware that we gradually create these new behaviors. And I'm telling you, if you've ever known somebody that's gone through some life change and you can say, wow, 10 years ago, you did used to do this more often, or you were kind of like this, and now you've grown. I mean, we call it maturity, right? Like we become better people. But at the end of the day, when you look at this, we have conscientiousness as that kind of linchpin of a predictor for success and attainment, even in long-term weight loss and health change. But the other ones are openness and love of learning, as I mentioned, and perseverance. And then specifically, when they had a section in this economic textbook on health and longevity, it was conscientiousness, openness. And they said, by the way, neuroticism leads to a shorter life. Because remember how it was correlated to blood pressure spikes. Every time something's not going your way, blood pressure's going up and cortisol and so forth. So I think we all know that. But again, if we see it in different contexts like this, I think it could be, somewhat helpful. So I actually talked a little bit more than I thought. So I thought I'd get through that a little quicker. Any thoughts or comments from you guys? Looks like Stacy and Amanda already took off.
I tell you what, that's the evolution of the Flexible Diet Institute you just explained. From me looking in from the outside in. Because old school, let's just use Joe 20 years ago, coaching professional bodybuilders. Cut the noodle in half to make your macro that day, that meal. Flexible Diet Institute, you even use it in context prep university all the time now. What does it say at the end of the week? When I first started working with you 2 years ago, I was cutting the noodle in half. And now I'm looking at a week, a bigger block of time. Now, granted, when you're at that level going for a world championship, it's a little different. You need to be a little more neurotic. But being conscientious fits right under the umbrella of the Flexible Dieting Institute. And I think that's how it was born. When the whole time I'm listening to your presentation, I said, Joe is explaining how he got to where he is right now by that evolution. Also, another point I want to bring up, Daniel Pink wrote a great book called Drive, and I show his video along with Angela Duckworth that you mentioned and some of the other authors you mentioned when I do leadership, we used to do leadership. One thing you didn't mention was Daniel Pink, and he actually shows that in some cases, the incentive inhibits high performance. And a lot of people who I would show that video to would flip out. And they flip out because they come from a different personality mold, and to them that's ridiculous. But in fact, he proved it scientifically. And he used, students from MIT and high producing investors and so on and so forth. But without knowing what you just explained, it's easy for people who have half the story to say that's impossible. It has to give you high performance. And the fact of the matter is, in some cases, it actually inhibits high performance. Incentive decreased performance.
Yeah, we did a research review on this about 6 months ago, and it did shock me. I mean, that's why I brought it up as a topic. I'm like, wow, it really is true that these people who were given a certain incentive, and it comes down to personality type, just didn't mean as much to them. They were interested more in the social connection and the team building and those kind of things. And so this is another reason why it matters knowing your personality, or those on your team, your family, your kids, because you don't know what's going to actually motivate them if you just think it's one thing, like your thing.
Yeah. And one last comment, you mentioned Dr. Angela Duckworth right up front. She turned conscientious into the word grit, and of course wrote a bestseller of that name. And basically she said in her book what you just did in 40 minutes, the same concept, that intelligence is important, but without that conscientiousness, it's not happening.
Yep, appreciate that, Dan.
You got it.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I took that test right at the beginning.
Big five?
Yeah, conscientiousness was 89. Second highest was emotional stability or neuroticism at 78. extroversion at 19. I was a little bummed I wasn't negative there, but just thought that was neat to validate that. And I got Gallup strengths that it would further validate me from a personality. But just to echo both of you, as far as, living it right now with academia, there is no incentive to me, financially, because that is my incentive in this context. We're asked for more volume or more, as more student volume comes in, the incentive to do that is, to me, it's not worth it. If you reach that threshold for my personality, that the fun is now lost when you have too much volume, because I guess it's that discount rate. To me, it's just, no, it's not worth it to me. So I'd rather change the whole playing field at that point. But it's just very cool to see the parallels, not only just in this context or this example, but certainly in other facets of life. It's just cool to put that together. And, it makes me understand Andra, where she's coming from in terms of her personality differences. And, it's easy to scald others, and vice versa. It's easy for me to be blamed for how I am, but it's I guess, humbling to see it on the other perspective of, if that's how they are, fine. But, much like you insinuated, Dan, when you're in contest, there is neurotic, you have to impart for that goal, but you understand the difference of when to apply it and when to, dial it down. And that's, of course, I would say that's the ultimate thing here, is we're aware enough to know when to dial it, when to not. And that's what makes us, I guess, balanced and even keeled ultimately.
That's the social intelligence of it. And so yesterday, Tyler Weeb and I recorded this week's Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And at one point toward the end, he talked about one of the greatest points of understanding personality psychology like this is so that you can understand other people. And like you just said, Kevin, instead of constantly saying, like, how do you do that? Why are you like that? Why can't you do this? Why can't you be more like me? The person can't. Like, their brain is a totally different brain. They don't think like us. And why should they? They have a different personality trait set, just like us, because of their DNA, because of their environmental upbringing and so forth, and life experiences. And if we just know these kinds of things, we can say, oh, I get it. I see why that. And instead of letting it just create all this rancor, it's like, oh, we understand each other. That's why we are the way we are. And we, agree on how we're going to make that work in our relationship when we move on. But one of the things that you said there too, Kevin, that I want to wrap up with, I love to look at cross-industry, cross-sector studies like this, because this is all about jobs and income and wealth and stick-to-itiveness in that kind of occupational sense. And then said, oh, by the way, all that also predicts longevity and health, And so going back to that internal locus of control and sense of self-efficacy, those of us who aren't motivated extrinsically, we're not extroverts by personality, we're not impulsive and neurotic, we're more mindful and conscientious. Why, Kevin, were you able to lose 120 pounds and keep it off? Why, instead of being 100 pounds overweight like all of my siblings and my dad, why was I able to change my life and maintain it the way I have in my health, even against all of my genetics? Because of the same things. We're doing it for the right reasons. We have aligned our behaviors with our health values. We're even keel about it. We're mindful. We're not doing it for that, big win at the end of the day. We're not doing it because I'm trying to lose 20 pounds or do this or that. It's just, we're doing it because that's who we want to be. And that's the foundation of conscientiousness, if you're applying it for the right reasons.